The region of India that I come from, called Manipur in northeast of India, our history are not even in textbooks of our country. So we don't exist in the narrative of India. They want our lands, our resources and territories, but they literally want us dead. They don't want us. We are treated as half citizens in the world's largest democracy. So what I want to share today, you will not find it in textbooks, you will not find it in the university manuals, you will not find it in the museums of our country or even in the world. This is based on 15 years of research, writing, and commitment that we have done to tell stories of our people, because many of our people do not leave our indigenous territories. I am one of the very few ones who have been tossed out of our region because of our political stand and our political work. So these are some of the research findings which I want to share. First, what is Manipur and northeast of India? The fabric that you're seeing here, right in front, the long strands, these are hand-woven by the indigenous women of Manipur. What I'm wearing today is not made in China. It's made in the villages of our region. We carry our history on our bodies, in our souls, in our speeches. So what is Manipur? Literally translated, land of jewels. Together with Manipur, northeast of India is home to 45 million indigenous communities. We have 272 groups. This part of India, which is below China, and we are surrounded, 98% of our borders are with 5 countries. We share only 22 kilometers with India in the tiny portion called Chicken Neck Corridor. But 98% of we share borders with, so I grew up in a border zone, as nation states call it. Otherwise, we were not border areas. It's really important to say.
Life changed in an instant for one man. It happened in the California desert nearly 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
Clear morning in June.
We are listening. All right. So, and this is also home to South Asia's longest running armed conflict. It's not in Pakistan or Afghanistan that you hear in your newspapers, but conflict in this part of India has been there since 1940s. Currently, there are 72 armed groups in this region. And we have 300,000 troops of the Indian Armed Forces, which are put in our soil to control all of us. And if you only hear of Kashmir, but you will not hear of Manipur and the northeast, where before Kashmir, an Armed Forces Special Powers Act was clamped in our soil since 1958. So for us, India cannot be the world's largest democracy as long as military boots are on our land. Our indigenous territory and borders are heavily militarized. These are pictures of India-Bangladesh border in Tripura, as I mentioned. And then we have next, militarized India, and this is the border of India and Myanmar. So I was born in a region which is just 2 hours away from Myanmar. So while we were talking about this, and I'll just share it. Currently, international relations have defined different types of borders: alienated borders, coexisting borders, independent borders, integrated borders. But that's the Westphalian concept. But for us, we are not borders. Our universe is centered around us. They made us as a part of borderlands, which we reject even today. Our lands are very beautiful, as you can see in these pictures. These are areas of Manipur. We are surrounded by 9 mountain ranges and a beautiful emerald green valley. If you look at these people, will you think they come out from Bollywood films, where the concept of India is what you see in Bollywood film, which is spread all over the world, from Africa to Asia to Latin America? Our people look like this. Our language is Tibeto-Burman. It's not Hindi or Sanskrit. We wear sarongs, not saris. We don't eat spices. We flavor our food with herbs. It's a very different type. But now we are asked to be called Indians. So that's why today's presentation was really inspiring, because of the sovereignty question. You talked about lacrosse. Polo is an indigenous game. If you do not know, please know today. 2 places in the world where polo originated has been attributed, Manipur and Mongolia. Polo for us is not a rich person's game played by elites. We have more than 30 polo teams in Manipur alone. It is an indigenous people's game propagated by colonial powers. Today, Indian polo teams do not carry Manipur polo teams saying that it's not polo enough. This is a level which even our games have been relegated. I have proof. This is how we play polo in Manipur. And women even play polo. We have an international women's polo team. So indigenous people, we don't live just in jungles. We are not what the rest of our people and community and colonial governments have told us to be. This is a picture of a book which my father wrote, which chronicled more than 3,000 years of Manipuri history. As we mentioned, Manipur was an independent Asiatic nation state with a 3,000-year-old history. And we were made into a part of India in 1949, a day which we commemorate as a Black Day every year in October 15. So in terms of again, as I mentioned, this part that we are describing is called India's Northeast, a region which is usually seen as a periphery of India, in which we are always told, "Madam, which country are you from?" There's a lot of racism against our people when we go to other parts of India, and it was always told that this region is not civilized enough vis-a-vis the rest of India. And as I mentioned, because of this violence, over 5-6 decades, there's a lot of resistance. And unlike resistance in other parts of the world, some of our groups have taken up armed resistance. Again, whether this is in today's world of after 9/11, where anybody who talked about self-determination or sovereignty is called a terrorist, it's now left to us, what do we do with this? So as I mentioned, many communities like ourselves are sandwiched between what I call the state and the non-state armed groups. And this is an area of work that we got to work deeper into. I am against violence, and I will be till I die. I do not like violence. But I have realized that many of our indigenous brothers have picked up arms in my region. And this makes the situation very complicated when we talk about it. Because many of these armed groups have also had their own human rights groups who go to Geneva and the UN Permanent Forum to represent their case. And we who are not belong to any armed group go to these forums. We have a tussle with our armed brothers and their representatives. But we are trying to get that space ourselves. On the other hand, our region is heavily militarized. This is how Indian Army patrol in our area. A friend of mine who came from South Africa said it looked like Iraq, the kind of militarization that we have. We are going to end here. So the other thing which I would like to know in terms of borders is that it is not just about our contestation with nation states. Indigenous regions, communities in our parts of the world have also created their own borders. And if another indigenous community confront their borders, we have an intercidal feud happening. This is an example from a Kuki-Naga clash in which more than 2,000 people were killed in the year 1997 to 2000, including 2-year-old children. A whole bus was thrown by a Naga group on a Kuki group where 30 people died over a gorge. I'm telling you, indigenous versus indigenous. And who is responsible? I'm sorry to say, is intelligence agencies of our countries. Because they are, what they do is, when they can confront an indigenous nation state which is strong enough, they arm other indigenous people. And that is happening in India's northeast, a region which in the United Nations, India has refused to accept that there is conflict, there is war, and there's militarization, and which is something that we are trying to do. As a result, and one of the research that I've done in university here is to map out who's arming and our indigenous territories. This is where it's so much connected with the global arms industry. So as indigenous activists and scholars, when we have to talk about bringing our dignity back, we have to confront against a military-industrial complex which has now inundated indigenous territories. We found 58 types of weapons from 13 countries flooding our indigenous border areas. These are the type of weapons. This is an image from Tripura of young men who surrendered their weapons. And these are all indigenous young men who have picked up arms and surrendered. So I have a few more minutes left, but I will focus now on looking at, as a result of this violence, 50,000 people have lost in this conflict, and 20,000 women are widowed in Manipur alone. My work started with helping many women who are survivors of these entrenched political conflict. This is a mother whose 2 sons were shot dead in one day. Some of us are mothers in this room. Imagine losing a child. But 2 of them, Imach and Rajini, whom I work very closely, these are many women who have lost with pictures of their loved ones. Christoph Heinz was a UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial execution, was not allowed to come to Manipur. So women went where he was, and this is an image of them showing the image of their loved ones. Young men between the age of 17 or 40 are considered as threats to India's sovereignty. So 3 to 4, because of the martial law, anybody could be killed, tortured, or disappeared on mere charges of suspicion. We have many cases of sexual violence in conflict. This is the body of Thangja Manorama, who was killed by 5 Indian paramilitary men who raped and killed her. And I'm going to end with the last few minutes left by showing a clip. I have many things to share, but I will leave it to us. But I want to show this clip, and I hope. And in Manipur, indigenous women and mothers did an extraordinary protest in the year 2000 after the rape and killing of a woman called Thangja Manorama, a protest which shook the entire country. And I would like to spend my next few minutes with this, and I hope I can carry this. So just give me a few minutes.
Manorama was ill seriously, and we are very shocked. We want to stop raping and to kill the women from Manipur by the security forces.
I said, "Now, throw lam thing as you have it. Now, when the polite by body, I go eat the shama, then I go polite by oh, hybrid must be the way. Lamia, Funjana.
I think I must do for Manorama and for the women of Manipur. I think the whole night, and I did not sleep and wept for Manoramas raping and killing like that.
aduga madai mi na hana thingina habadi wakanda pi na na mai mai ni ti de japani na ko
felt any inferiority in our minds. We were proud of our mother and all the other mothers that took part in the recitation.
And this, today for the first time, I want to show the flag of Manipur. We never took it out, but the Haudenosaunee people have given us the courage to do this. Because if we do this in India, I would be arrested now.
Thank you very much, Bina, for bringing us this world that we need to think about. Thank you. Hana.
First of all, I want to thank Elsa, Tona, and Cheryl, and Binalakshmi for organizing this symposium. And thank you, Bina, for that presentation. It was very, very moving. So today I'm going to talk about the concept of the state of exception as used by Giorgio Agamben and how I relate it to the situation of the Juma indigenous people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. As Elsa pointed out before, my work actually stems from the work that I did with the Chittagong Hill Tracts Commission. I've been working as the coordinator of that advocacy body since 2009. And I'm actually very glad that I'm here today because Elsa is the co-chair of, one of the co-chairs of the commission, and Tona next to me is also one of the members of the commission. And I'm also very happy that Chandra Di is here today. She's a Chakma national from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, and she has also written extensively about land rights and militarization in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So I'm very happy that she's here today. To talk about the situation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, on December 2, 1997, the government of Bangladesh signed the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord with the Shanti Bahini, or the Peace Force, which is the armed wing of the Parbotya Chattogram Janasanghati Samiti, the PCGSS. So the accord, which was popularly called the Shanti Chukti, or the Peace Accord, was an agreement for a form of autonomy that the Juma indigenous people had been seeking since Bangladesh became an independent country in 1971. But the changing political context in Bangladesh at the time, with a new political party in power and the changing dynamics between Bangladesh and its neighbors, had a big role to play in how the negotiations between the PCJSS and the government played out, and the speed with which the negotiations were reached. And with the Awami League in power, which is also the political party in power at present, for the first time since the assassination of its founder in 1975, India became a force in these negotiations, and the accord was quite widely welcomed as a progressive force that had the power to normalize the situation in the hills after more than 2 decades of armed struggle, during which the Bangladesh military carried out a number of massacres, human rights violations, carried out a transmigration program to bring in Bengali settlers, and maintain a media blackout in the area for more than 2 decades. So every year on December 2, the government of Bangladesh claims that the implementation of the peace accord is almost complete. And every year the Juma indigenous activists demand the implementation of the CHT accord and saying that most of the, actually all of the important parts of the accord have not been implemented. While the peace accord is still being upheld as a solution to the conflict in the hills, the region remains in a state of exception where the constitutional rights of indigenous Jumas as citizens of Bangladesh are suspended by the government through an extension of power to protect the sovereignty of the state. Actually, a lot of the things that Bina was talking about reminded me of the situation in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. This state of exception has led to Juma people being evicted from their lands on a very large scale, continued military surveillance on Jumas living inside the hills, violence against Juma women, and deforestation of the hills leading to various negative environmental impacts. So as I said before, in 2009 I joined as the coordinator of the advocacy body, the International Chittagong Hill Tracts Commission, whose work is to promote respect for human rights and to monitor the implementation of the peace accord. My work at the Commission, and more specifically our inability to do the work, triggered by repeated vicious attacks on us as well as the Juma colleagues who work with us, by state forces, kind of led me to, coming to academia to research on this issue. So the Chittagong Hill Tracts is located in the southeastern corner of the country and consists of 3 districts, Khagachuri, Bandarbon, and Rangamati. Khagachuri shares borders with the Indian state of Tripura on the north and west. Rangamati shares its borders with Indian Mizoram on the east, and Bandarbon shares its border with Myanmar on the south and the southeast. These 3 districts of Bangladesh have the highest military presence in Bangladesh, where the military carried out a campaign of systematic violence against the Juma indigenous people of the region. Its geographical position of sharing borders with India and Myanmar makes it a very strategic location for the Bangladeshi state, and I explain how it is the rhetoric that is used by the Bangladesh government to carry out violence against the Juma people. However, these are not the only borders that the Juma people have to face. The hills are also marked by internal borders or military checkpoints. I remember someone was talking about military checkpoints yesterday. The peace accord, while it stipulated for the dismantling of the military camps within the hills, the military presence in the area has actually increased in number since the peace accord was signed. And the military basically enforces peace with guns, checkpoints, and thorough surveillance and intimidation of Juma activists, which include regular and random house searches and cases filed against the Juma, especially the activists who are too active in their work, I guess. And a military operation ensures impunity to military and other perpetrators who carry out violence against the Jumas. Just to give a little bit of context of how the hills became a so-called border region, although the situation of the hills is in some ways very similar to other indigenous communities in post-colonial nations, in some ways the situation is also very unique. Before the British arrived in what is now South Asia, the hills earlier was known as the Kapas Mahal, or the Cotton State. And it was an independent region, and unlike the rest of what is now South Asia, were not under Mughal rule. The Jumas did have trade relations with the Mughals and then trade relations with the British, but it was not until 1857 that the region came under direct British rule. And as Chandadi yesterday pointed out, the Juma people found themselves first to be under British colonial India, and then after the British partition, they found themselves becoming nationals of Pakistan, and then after 1971, they became nationals of Bangladesh. So the face of the colonizer changed several times for the Juma as a result of the drawing of these borders and these partitions. The documentary practices, paperwork, and checkpoints maintained by the state are a form of surveillance and violence against people in the so-called margins who are considered less than citizens because of their otherness as ethnic and religious, because of their ethnic and religious identity, and their geographical location in the borders, which is a very strategic space for this nation state. So the hills are a form of what Victoria Sanford calls an interior frontier, which is demarcated by army checkpoints. The checkpoints at the entrances of the CHT perform kind of a similar role as the state's territorial border. And the recent study by MRIP on Indigenous peoples' rights in the context of borders, migration, and displacement that Elsa sent out last week says, and I quote here, "The Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh continues to be one of the most militarized areas in the world, following the settlement of non-Indigenous people on Indigenous people's land and the ensuing conflict." Excuse me. It is difficult to give a true picture of what militarization means for the Juma people in the hills. Apart from the military checkpoints and requirement for permits for foreigners and regular intimidation of Juma activists, journalists, and military, the military overrides the civil administration of the hills, and decisions taken by the military remain unquestioned and are seen through the lens of conflict management. So having worked for many years as a Bengali journalist myself based in Dhaka, I have witnessed the caution that is followed every day regarding the reporting on incidents that happened in the hills. We are told always that we have to report it in a certain way. We cannot write certain words. I'll give you one example. I think, I can't remember the year, but it was like last in the 5 years, I think. The Daily Star and Prothom Alo, the two of the largest English and Bengali newspapers in the country, lost 40% of their advertising revenue following a report about military killing when the dead were identified as indigenous instead of terrorists. So the military basically said the 5 people who were killed were terrorists, and you identified them as indigenous in your newspapers. So that was a no-no. There are a number of restrictions on the work of activists and NGOs who operate in the hills, including who they can employ, who can their beneficiaries be, and what kind of work they can do. In fact, what kind of words is used in their documentation papers. Everything has to be couched in a language that is edible for Bangladesh, basically. And since a report by the Special Rapporteur in 2011 at the UN Permanent Forum criticized the role of the military in the hills, the Bangladesh government has declared that there are no indigenous people in the country and has strictly declared the word indigenous or Adibashi not to be used in government documents. Government officials are under strict orders not to attend or support any celebrations related to World Indigenous Peoples Day. And within the geographic area of the 3 hill districts, there is no permission given in the last few years for organizing any programs related to World Indigenous Peoples Day. It's also since 2011 that the work of the CHT Commission has been threatened, first by intelligence officials flooding the rooms where Commission members were scheduled to talk to the victims of human rights abuse in 2011, and Elsa was there at the time. Then by attacking the vehicle that was carrying members of the CHT Commission in 2014, and then by continuous hacking of the CHT Commission's website several times with threatening messages. In the last 2 years, the number of extrajudicial killings have gone up, and Juma activists have been specifically targeted. Many of the core Juma activists, a lot of them who are colleagues who have worked with us, have disappeared, been silenced, killed, and many have taken asylum in various countries. A lot of them are actually asylum seekers here in the US, in New York. And the case of Kalpana Chakma, who disappeared in 1996, is one case. In 2019, in the same way, one of the key Juma activists, Michael Chakma, was picked up by the military intelligence and disappeared. Neither of them have been found yet. There's no traces of what happened to them. While the military acts as a source of surveillance and violence against the Juma people, they and the border guards have also been performing a very curiously different role in places that have been marked as tourist spots in the hills. At these military-run tourist spots, the military officials registers tourists who are overwhelmingly Bengalis from the city, provides them with full protection, controls the water transportation to the area, owns luxury hotels in the area, and provides permission to the Juma people for setting up guest houses for tourists. At specific locations throughout these tourist areas, military officers are seen standing vigilant with their firearms. Many of these tourist spots are close to the borders of India and Myanmar. And while the vicinity of the border is used as an excuse to increase surveillance over the Juma indigenous people, the border also serves as a sort of attraction for Bengali tourists. So, going back to my argument of the concept of the state of exception, it is a social and political force which is crucial to understanding citizenship and political subject formation of the Jumas. The state of exception is similar to a state of emergency, where basic human rights, as understood by national or international laws, are suspended and state sovereignty stands above all laws. While wars and emergencies often call for such a situation, the state of exception is often invoked in situations where certain racialized communities are considered to be a threat to the sovereignty of the state. And modern totalitarian regimes are based on the idea of the state of exception that, as Ahmed pointed out, allows for the physical elimination not only of political adversaries but of entire categories of citizens who for some reason cannot be integrated into the political system. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, national laws regarding rights of a citizen no longer apply to these individuals. Extrajudicial actions by officials of the state are deemed acceptable because of an unspoken declaration of state of exception. Therefore, under a spoken or unspoken state of exception, people living around these borderlands are deprived of the rights of citizens. In borders and border-like areas such as checkpoints, for example, the state's use of documents are the means through which the state exercises its power to dominate, exploit, and expropriate. In many contemporary post-colonial states, it works beyond the power of life and death to the power to threaten the citizen with death and instill fear in the citizen of such a threat. This power is even more greatly felt by marginalized populations such as the Juma. So Bangladesh basically denies recognition in the constitution of the Joma people, marginalizes them economically and politically, represents them as the ethnic other, and criminalizes them through the media in order to justify the securitization of the hills. In order to continue its repression and exploitation, the Bangladeshi state fuels nationalist passions and invokes a narrative in which sovereignty and a Muslim Bengali identity that is threatened by indigenous claims are key elements. Unfortunately, resorting to such nationalist rhetoric is quite common in post-colonial countries, in areas where indigenous people have led movements for self-determination, demanding recognition of communal land ownership rights or political and administrative autonomy. While the government of Bangladesh signed an accord to resolve the conflict that led to 2 decades of military violence in the hills, opposition to a hastily drafted accord, failure to implement its important clauses, and the Bengali Muslim chauvinism in dealing with the issues raised by the Jumas has led to the present violent situation in the hills. Thank you.
Thank you, Hana, for pointing out through this very disconcerting example that has been there since the beginnings. The indigenous peoples have been coming to the United Nations. That's how early the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh have been coming, CH2 in particular, have been coming to raise these incredible situations that they are suffering. But also you point out the link between state of exception, sovereignty, racialized groups, and in post-colonial settings. So that is also a conceptual framework that can be useful in our analysis of these situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asa. We are going to shift somewhat issues, but I hope that we are circulating around borderologies in very many senses, and probably my paper is dealing with something which I think so far hasn't been much touched upon, though in a way, in a broad way it's been mentioned, namely how do we conceptualize the dynamic dialectics between psychological borders and physical and social borders. So I'll try to approach that in a sort of concrete case, focusing on one particular group in South Asia called the Shantas or the Horhopon. Their very name, the most ancient name, Horhopon, Hor means actually human being, and Hopon means offspring of human being. And I think that very name speaks to us in a very profound manner, which we need to understand. They also have other categorical names which are of various historical antiquity which they claim themselves, but I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it's for your basic information. So what I want to sort of just do is to highlight a couple of the questions now I'm working on, because I really feel that as a interdisciplinary social scientist, at times a development worker, at times advocate, and all of that, I'm trying to do some stitching together of various knowledge domains which has hardly been tried stitched together. So I'm on fairly new terrain myself, both from my original discipline and in other ways. So it's kind of an ongoing, evolving work, and I need to now spend gradually more time with indigenous gurus and intellectuals to really see if they think I'm on the right track. So basically, this picture, what is that? I mean, obviously, you can immediately, if we are a bit stereotypic, we will just say, oh, it's a kind of dance form, probably some sort of traditional dance form. My men will say it's a tribal one. If they know the more the Wisconsin, they will say it's the tribal Santal. The women are dancing and the men are drumming. Thing is that if you look at it from a kind of a bow and foreigner perspective, we simply will trivialize and make it into a kind of folklore tradition. What I'm trying to grapple with is, for example, that social dance form probably has a very important role in transforming subconscious memory across generations, across enormous amount of generations. So I'm trying to grapple with the kind of social technologies of oral formations through history. That's, I think, basically what I'm working on now, and that's quite a new terrain. Here you see, here are the different self-referential categories. You have the state one, tribals, which is anchored in the constitutions, and for example, the Santas have recognition on the 6th schedule in a couple of states, but not all the states they live in. Some, of course, also have really come out international, globally, and claimed the state as indigenous. And I think what the case I'm working on now really challenges on is how do we grapple with formations which has been mobile formations for thousands of years and which has gone through various phases. And it's not linear narrative. It's not like you sort of were hunter and gatherers, then gradually you went into a new kind of adaptation. It's a much more complex and interesting process. And actually, what I'm claiming is that the Santas and a number of other Munda and Derridian-speaking groups, indigenous language families, actually has very strong linkages to the largest ancient civilization in the Brahmaputra Valley, called the Harappa civilization. So this is the kind of thing I'm now trying to find a way a scientific way, but a way which is also sensitive to the oral narrative traditions of the Santals themselves, because they have a huge epical tradition, which was first written down by actually a Norwegian missionary who attended that recitation together with the chief in 1867. So that kind of transformation into a text has been enormously influential, but it hasn't somehow destroyed also the kind of vital oral tradition to live on. So basically, these are my questions, which I'm trying to grapple with. How do transhistory, migration, cultural formation remember? What are the social tools for remembrances? My next question, are the Santals transhistory cosmopolitans? What's the evidence? And how should we define cosmopolitanism? What are indigenous cosmopolitanism in different continents? And then a third question, what are the dialectics between psychological, social, and physical borders? And I'll come back to a case on that. My fourth interest, understanding Ho'oponopono worldview. And here I'm trying to kind of establish an ontology of how they understand mind, body, especially the relationship between the soul and action. And this is amazingly little understood or tried to grapple with in a collaborative manner. I'm very struck by it because my belief is that if we don't understand that, for example, the Ho'oponopono has a kind of understanding of action and of mindfulness, which is fundamentally different from our Western and Cartesian philosophical one. So the soul is a material force. So soul stuff is floating, not just within bodies, but between bodies, and not just between humans, but between humans and all other living beings. So we're speaking of a world web of different kinds of living beings, which are not considered categorically different. And if one doesn't understand that kind of philosophy, one doesn't understand also how this society thinks in terms of moral and immoral action. So that's my take on witchcraft, right? Which is a very sensitive, troubled kind of issues, which sort of Westerners has been interested in since the missionaries came. And it's been completely entrenched as a very kind of judgmental and discourse of our right to act sovereign because sort of these people are irrational. So because of this entrenched kind of understanding, in my generation, often we shied away from debating this at all because it was so troubled. Then we worked with human rights activists who specifically would try to minimize the number of witchcraft murders, because there was quite a high number of murders, even from the time I was an anthropologist first in my young years in Bangladesh in the 1980s. So I observed and sort of spoke with the families of a number of murdered women while I lived there for the first couple of years and interviewed gurus and so on. So anyway, the ontology of mind and soul is a key area to understand. We have to work so hard, I think, to come on this together with the gurus. And I think that also partly explains why, as scholars, not just my generation, but previous generation, have failed to explain the persistence of witchcraft in Santal society. Because that's the kind of very important thing when you read the historical and contemporary literature. It's always been there at least as long as the British were on the continent. But the troubled thing is that after so-called independence in 1947, it didn't radically decline, and it's actually become more prevalent again in several areas where Santal live. Then embodied transhistory remembrances. So I'm going into the Santal pan-epics, which is shared across the Santal world in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, trials, and so on. And I've been reviewing witchcraft literature both during the colonial period, after 1947, and so on, and see that we are stuck. We haven't come further in understanding this in a meaningful, respectful way, because we shy away from striving ideologically to understand it, their ways of memorizing, their ontology, their intellectual realm in a profound manner. So what I'm also working on now is to understand the centrality of marriage institution of these people, because it's my firm belief that marriage rituals can be sustained through very long historical time spans, because you don't need a lot of external technologies. We have to understand how the body, how the voice, how poetics, how the drums together are a powerful kind of realm of social technologies which sustain this kind of intergenerational dynamics. So what I basically expose to you is two different approaches to reappropriate Santal prehistory and history. In my network there is a young Santal scholar, Santo Soren, who has recently written a very interesting piece where he returned to colonial texts, to maps and so on, and sort of appropriates classical Western history in order to really spot the so-called Chai Champa, the period where the Santas had a more or less sovereign land. And this has, by classical social science, been dismissed as pure sort of mythological. There's no way we can spot this. But he has come very far, actually, in being able to localize that, because at a certain point, the British geographers were pretty specific in mapping this out. Then these names disappeared after a particular period. So I'm very glad that this kind of work going on by indigenous scholars themselves. So basically what I'm trying now to work on, in the context of a very, very dire development in India, and I would say also in Bangladesh, which is ethno-nationalism, which are in both countries extraordinarily exclusive. But what is happening in India is the Hinduist or Hinduatma version of nativist appropriation. And they are happening at a time where interdisciplinary science on prehistory is doing tremendous advances. So this is the kind of very paradoxical situation that as the findings now really comes out, saying that, for example, the Harappa civilization was an autochthonous kind of formation. It actually grew out of dynamic relations between various hunters and gatherers, and then sipped in a bit of technology of early kind of agriculture and so on. But it wasn't like, farmers from Middle East coming in and lifting up a civilization. It's the wrong narrative altogether. And also now we can really see how the Harappans then, when their civilization declined due to environmental dynamics, they actually turned rural. So again here we have a civilization which was urban, indigenous, which gradually turned rural and spread out, fanned out to the south of India, to central India, and to what's within now Bangladesh, in a very fascinating and complex kind of network. So I think trying to map this in a much more profound manner is very, very important. Other things which now come out in this research, for example, is that there was no Aryan invasion to the Harappan area. It was just a sipping in while the Harappans had dilemmas of how to deal with the foreigners who came on horses. And I'm trying to ask new questions. What do you do in a formation when suddenly you got, year by year, people who speak an entirely different language, who come on horses, who has a different technology, different ideas about gender, and they come just as groups of men. And they are extraordinarily interested in marrying with indigenous women. So all these dilemmas, how you handle that kind of historical situation for a couple of generations, where are the evidences for that? I think I see those kinds of evidences, for example, in the Santas, extraordinary sophisticated system of formalizing relationship. They have 6 to 7 different kinds of marital kinds of union, and they're somehow fascinatingly modern and pragmatic. And I think this is something which really reflects that kind of cosmopolitan history, but we have simply not understood that this is the message which it carries through. So in the end, I just wanted to share that I think when I sat on a kind of cottage in Portugal before I came here for 10 days to read up on the newest kind of advances of sciences on this kind of civilizational findings of South Asia. And I've tried my best now to sort of grapple with how do they work, these international teams. There are scholars from Princeton, they are from Harvard, they are from Pune, they are from Benares, and of course, mind you, there is hardly any eminent Indian on the team who come from these indigenous backgrounds. And mind you, the kind of research which is prioritized is what can be kind of associated with high civilization. So the Harappan civilization attracts an enormous amount of fund, while, for example, the other central areas of India and South India, including the territories of the Santhals, have received much less funding. And I think we actually has to work on, pinpointing this and challenging a reprioritization of funds. So this last thing I wanted to say is that then what is missing in this exciting body of research, which is now done by genetics, it's done by linguistics, it's done by archaeologians, it's done by epihistorians. I think most seriously lacking is understanding that transhistorical oral traditions matters, and they carry an enormous amount of valuable information. They are archaeologies in their own, but we haven't understood how this social technology is formed and transmuted and sustained in these kinds of dynamic environments. And of course, the whole construction of tribals and tribalism will wither away by this kind of understanding. It's an absolute false kinds of construction, which goes well beyond the kind of critique we have usually tried to somehow challenge the tribal construction with. So this is basically my last slide, which addresses this enormously politicized issue. We are the Harappans. Now, this is at least what the research front now can say. This is the most representative person group of the Harappan civilization. That are Gond women and probably also around Kuruk women because of the maternal line, right? And because it's really quite likely that the early Harappan spoke a Dravidian language, though we can't finally prove it as yet. But of course, this is so contrary to everything which is exposed in Indian media about the findings. Even the scientists, the prominent scientists, don't dare to actually advocate and share these findings. They are actually so under-communicating key findings of this research. So this is the highly politicized situation, and I just hope that together we can somehow create a space here for these genuine evidence-based narratives. And we really need also to work on understanding the basics of how this research works, because there are a lot of negative experiences within indigenous societies in terms of racist understandings, racist methodologies, not unethical methods of collecting information, including blood samples and so on. So I do think we should work on establishing a kind of ethical protocol and procedures, which can aid this to become a much more inclusive and dignified kind of research frontier, which is really deserved. And we have lots to contribute by claiming the importance of embodied oral narratives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tone, and for using different concepts, actually, of borders, the way you articulated it. But also, I feel that all three panelists you did touch on implicitly on concepts of indigenous cosmopolitanism, which also ties us to the earlier panel. So I would like to open it up for comments, questions.
Maybe I'll go first. First of all, thank you very much to the panelists and in my personal capacity, just to recognize the contributions that all of you have done, of course, to the CHT, and just to put that into the context. But it's a very interesting, the way the three presentations actually kind of overlap, yet are very different. And this is what, one of the things I was looking at, that first to start off with Tony Blaire's Tony's presentation. I was very intrigued when you talk about the Harappans, because studying history, there you think of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa as a very kind of ancient civilization. I was just talking to my colleague that in a way it's like the Incas or the Mayans of the Latin American context. So to relate that to the indigenous peoples, and you point out the Gond, which is one of these in India, one of these very small indigenous people there, that must be quite a surprising concept, let's say, for some of them, to the scholars, let's say, by context, to take on board. That's one point. The second one is when you talk about witchcraft. And here we just went through Halloween, where in the US it's a very big festival given to children. But it brought to mind the Salem trials, the witch trials. And there's some kind of it comes into the whole thing of the feminine mystique, let's say, that where they are scared is maybe these are just women who are extremely intuitive. But there is a fear of the unknown. I know that my husband sometimes tells me he's very happy I'm born now. If I had been born earlier, I might have been burned, he says. Because, there are certain things I just know. And that's the same for all of us, I think. I'm sure the men also have that kind of thoughts, but it's intuitive sometimes. And perhaps this comes back to what you were saying about the souls. Because, of course, for us, we Buddhists, it's karma, the soul, just basically the same soul, it just goes from body to body as a receptor. The second one I was looking at from both Bina and Hana's presentations is that these are both border areas, which are kind of like part of and yet not part of the countries wherein they exist now. And there's this feeling of alienation, which is both sides. There's a feeling of acceptance and a feeling of not being recognized and accepted. And of course, I come from there, so I was also sharing with Bina that when I'm in India, they think I'm also from Northeast India. The whole discrimination that you face immediately, it's just in your face kind of thing. And how do you address that? Because these things are not going to change. We are where we are. Borders have been drawn around us, but how do you address that? And what is the way that we can make sure that there is greater recognition, greater coexistence, while recognizing the differences, without having these heavy-handed approaches which take lives and are so violent? And I include Elsa in my question on that. Thank you.
Would you like to address? Yes.
Tony, how come a Norwegian comes and researches Santals? And it's like completely like amazing the kind of work you do. At the same time, when we are dealing with real life deaths, body counts, disappear, extrajudicial execution, we can't think of soul right now. It's like, how do we save more lives? How do we ensure that, as I said, at least the Santals are written in the narrative of India. But as like Chandra said, the first time I confronted racism in my life was in New Delhi. When someone called me Chinky. And I didn't know the word chinky. It means people with small mongoloid features. You see, like Chandradi.
Thank you.
You see. So, in terms of indigeneity and racism, it's imprinted on our face, literally. And that's exactly what we need to confront in terms of how do we handle with this. So, I don't know how far, Tony, in terms of Santal, do they come in the Dalits? Do they think that in your research have you ensured the connection between the work which is being done? Because in terms of Dalit activism, the Santals, where do they fit in the Dalit framework of things? I would like to know whether you've come across many of these. And on the other hand, yes, there's a lot of, India is a land of 500 million poor. 40% of people in the indigenous territories of Northeast live under poverty line. And so these are some of the concerns which you mentioned also of the Santal region of there's a real economic disempowerment going on in these regions. So that's one thing I wanted to and in terms of witchcraft, is interestingly, in Assam, which is one of our regions, near my region, the women who are termed as witches are women who have properties. Single women who have properties. They are not like single women with properties. Please look up Assam, ASSAM, and witches. In fact, not just women, but young men in Meghalaya, which is bordering with Bangladesh, and I have been in these territories. In matrilineal societies, I saw 7 members of a family being killed on charges of witchcraft. And they were not women, they were men too. They were educated men of the region. In Garo Hills, we have investigated that. I've been to those regions. So in terms of witchcraft, India's thing presents a very complicated picture of what's happening there. But women and land, single women who have land, are burned, are mobbed, are lynched on charges of witches in Assam right now. Okay, and Chandraji's last point in terms of in these border areas, how do we address the issue of, this is exactly for 15 years, we started these organizations to actually negotiate with the government of India to recognize India is a signatory of the UN Convention on Ending Racial Discrimination, signed in 1967, to help apartheid regime, get apartheid. But it refuses to believe that racism exists in India, even though India is divided into people are in India. Caste system is one of the most racist way of saying, the human beings are divided into 4 categories. So I think, in fact, here in this very room, Suraj Yengde, a scholar from Harvard on Dalits, actually called, don't say India as a nation. India is a Brahminical India, where 3% of Brahmins own 57% of India's resource. So as long as the Brahminical concept of idea exists, and the Brahmins were only told, we couldn't read and write because the Brahmins had access to that, So I think, in terms of addressing, we will have to, many of the diplomats in UN from India are Brahmins. Many of the Indian scholars you meet in Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Ivy, or Connecticut College are all Brahmins. So when some of us come there, they think of us how do you even arrive here, So seriously, we're talking about a Brahminical India, and to address issues of racism and indigeneity is going to take the next 100 years, but we are in it.
Well, a lot of strong statements. Let me just say a few things. And let's say, for example, in the paper, I do quite a review in historical period of witchcraft. Okay, I couldn't sort of nuance that. And what is very clear is that as dispossession, land as dispossession increased in Chotanagpur from the mid-1980s onward, including also at the same time imposition of Deco land laws, banning of witchcraft, increases in famines, increases in epidemics, all these sort of exposed the indigenous society over a couple of decades to an immense amount of pressures. And it was in this pressured situation of multiple pressures, both a new wave of resistant movement arose, like the Santa's 1955-56 mass movement, which led the British to murder 10,000 or so over a few months. And it was in this situation that, and this is part of my struggle to try to explain this in a much more deep manner, that when their warriors could not withstand the musket of the British soldiers, which the deities had sort of promised them that they would sort of, make the warriors completely withstand any kind of assault, they kind of turned on themselves, and there was a process of internal purging which directed itself towards women. So a good number of women was then accused for witchcraft. They had kind of destroyed the imbalances between humans and God, which was the causal consequence then was that the warriors, could not withstand the bullet. So we need to understand these kinds of internal dynamics much better than we have so far. And I think then we can also explain the persistence of these practices. Another very important issue which comes out in my paper is that we have to understand these formations, they have very dynamic borders. It's not like they have these hard, we often strive for very hard delineation. I am indigenous, you are non-indigenous. What these through history has done is that they have in periods intermarried or had alliances with other cultural formation they welcomed or at least had to tolerate. Then some would, kind of specify in some profession and they become low caste, and the rest would move on and would retain kind of their borders. Might be for a couple of 100 years they were in a position in certain territories to really keep a lot of distance to other formations. So it's this dynamic of history. It's absolutely non-linear, which we really have to, understand. This is a form of cosmopolitanism, and the epics even say it. In a period then we had to comply with, the neighborship of some other groups. So we decided that we would somehow, accept some kind of unions. We would lend some kind of aspects of the chiefman institution to our own chiefly institution and so on. It's all there, but we haven't listened. This is my thing.
Chandra, the questions that you asked is something that I think we can have another conference just to discuss how do you address such issues. It's a big question. I mean, if I bring it down to the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the peace accord was formed, and every day goes by, as every month goes by, year goes by, it becomes more and more difficult to implement the accord. The Bangladesh government, if it had the goodwill to actually carry out the implementation, would have done it long ago. I think when they signed the accord, they knew that they were not going to implement it. And they only implemented those sections of the accord that does not have a big impact on the actual policies. Like having a CHT ministry is amazing in concept, in theory, but what is the ministry doing? It's actually working against the indigenous people. The land commission that was supposed to solve the land disputes is an amazing thing conceptually, but what has it done? Nothing. So unless there is goodwill from the government, it's not going to be solved. And increasingly, we see right-wing forces getting strengthened all over the world. And especially in border areas, the right-wing forces are becoming more and more powerful. So militarization is becoming an increasingly obvious way to deal with people in the so-called fringes. So, but I don't want to think that this is not a situation that can be solved. I want to think that it is possible. There are people who do want it solved, but how do we move that forward? I mean, there are certain things that people can do, but how do you convince people? How do you get rid of inequality? I think it all boils down to ultimately inequality. That some people think that they are somehow racially superior to the others, and that's the case in Bangladesh. When I went to do my MA fieldwork in that region, I spoke to a lot of tourists. My focus was on military-based tourism. I spoke to a lot of tourists, and they were very, they love the culture of the indigenous people. It's very colorful, it's very beautiful, the food is amazing, everything is great. But you know what, they shouldn't have done that in the 1970s and 1980s. They wanted to have their, own autonomous area. Why did they want that? Why don't they want to become part of Bangladesh? And they did not want to become independent at the time. It was just a form of sovereignty that people wanted. But still, people, like young people, I talked to a lot of tourists there, and they just don't understand the concept of autonomy, of being different, of being respectful to different cultures, to have the right to have your own cultural language and way of living, way of owning land, all those things, they just don't want to understand. So I think there also a lot of work needs to be done for people who are going to eventually become policymakers in Bangladesh and in other countries where there are indigenous people, to change the way of thinking. I don't know how to do that. It has to start somewhere.
This idea that the typologies of different conceptions of borders that indigenous peoples have been developing, whether we call it sovereignties, public sovereignties, different ways of exercising self-determination. I think this inequality that you mentioned is not just inequality of resources, it's inequality also of access to education and to common public space, so we can share ideas and these different typologies of indigenous borders and borderologies to come to the fore and to be grappled with by all of us. The truth is that, as we see, it's obvious, the Australian state still holds strong, and we have not yet managed to get these different points through. And that's why I want to come back and bring back what Ellie was saying yesterday about how indigenous peoples can and do change the concepts of borders and not just see them as military or economic zones, but cultural and spiritual. And since we are in Asia right now, of course we have India, Bangladesh. You know that the two are linked like this. And one harbors the indigenous of the other while persecuting their own. It's what's happening. This is an incredible irony. So I wonder, what kinds of very creative initiatives can take place with a lot of solidarity, to give high profile to different initiatives of indigenous peoples of areas, that are across, around borders that are so contested and so sensitive and militarized. What can be done to give a different and the indigenous cosmopolitanism? Let's use this term for a minute. So these are the thoughts that I am just inspired from the discussion here. Share. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a few maybe comments and thoughts. So one is about South-South cooperation. At least we talk a lot about South-South cooperation in the UN. It's very friendly. And I was wondering, I'm not an expert on Asia, but I've heard this is not the first time that I hear that in terms of indigenous issues, it's a very complex, politically sensitive, in several states. I mean, the issue of not recognition, the issue that you cannot even call yourself indigenous people. I mean, it's completely different from, let's say, what's happening in Latin America, right? But then when I look, I'm more familiar with Latin America. I'm half Peruvian. I come from a mixed family. So I know I've heard stories growing up, and Peru was this very conservative country, extremely conservative country. In the 90s, there was a president who was questioned yet, but some people said that the state policy was to sterilize indigenous women. So that was Peru in the 90s. And it changed. In 2000, there was the first indigenous president, the only one I think actually, and Toledo. And then, like this year, Peru hosted the Pan American Games. And during the wonderful opening ceremony, for I think it was an hour, indigenous people were hosting the shows. I mean, it was a celebration of indigenous traditions, colors, and as you were saying, it is now regarded as something appreciated that you can learn from, and so there's a twist happening. It's not perfect, but I see progress. I see how the society has changed. And this has happened because of education, I think to some degree, because of international influence, but then it is happening. And of course Latin America is a very different context, but I wonder if some kind of discussion is or could happen to strengthen, because even though it's such a different path, at the same time, you guys are facing similar struggles of discrimination, of not being regarded as the same people, like citizens, so in that sense, I wonder if that is something that you guys are exploring. And in my experience, what I've seen so far is that really the strength of Latin America is the network. Like these guys, they're not all thinking the same thing, but they've managed to create these really strong networks. I mean, what we're seeing in Bolivia and Ecuador are some examples, but I think some of the strength came with that initiative. And I don't know how they got there, frankly. I wasn't there, but I wonder if this is something, and I had another thought, but it escaped me, so.
When you remember that. Okay. Yes.
I guess my question was inspired primarily by Bina, but it's appropriate for all of you. And it was brought forward by these last two comments, because it's something from a point of view of not being so familiar with the Asian context, or any more connected to African indigeneity and indigenous issues, but the urgency also with which Bina's conversation brought to light, I think, this question of solidarity and what it means in a very pointed way. Because I think I want to underscore what's already, I think, been asked. What does solidarity mean in this context for us? It's an academic question, it's a question for academics, it's a question for activists, but it's a question of some urgency, more in some places than others. Because, again, in certain contexts, things seem to be going along a progression where they can be seen as some kind of progress. Whereas in Manipur, it sounds like things are as bad, if not worse, than they've ever been for 61 plus years. And what does that mean? What does that mean to us as a group of scholars and activist counterparts in concrete terms?
Can I take this question? Thank you so much to both of you. As I mentioned, I testified in the beginning that many of us are, even if I'm here, constantly, you cannot exile the human mind and the heart. So, constant touch with my community back home. And it's so urgent as things are becoming, as Matt said, really worsened right now. We're attempting to change, write the indigenous history as a Hindutva based on the epics of India. That's the problem that we have with epics. They're trying to make Mahabharata or the Ramayana of Hindu mythology epics. So we are every level, through our way of worship, to our history or lack of it. It's not even written there, but they're trying to redone the narrative, to putting military on our lives. For us, it's an urgent issue, appealing for help. So one of the things which I'm going to recommend is that this humble body, even though some of us are not like in hundreds here, I'm a believer it's not numbers, it's a quality of people who are are committed to this, to pass a resolution of many of these indigenous people who have never been recognized on the global scale. For example, you have repeated recognition, for example, of Naga movement, but never of the movement by the Manipuri indigenous people. There's never been an international tribunal on Manipur, even if 20,000 people have been killed and many have disappeared and died. So one of the ways in which a global thing would come is to recognize, and some of us in this room could be a part of that international tribunal to start looking on these issues. And there are so many, if you know of many war zones where many of these conflicts are indigenous territory, you know, the most militarized zones in the world are in indigenous territories, whether it's in Latin America, in Asia, Africa, it is in indigenous soil, you see. So I think we have to pass a resolution in terms of militarization of indigenous lands and how do we do it. And the other thing is in terms of and I'm picking it up because we're not saying we cannot just leave it to what can I say? Let me just, yeah. Okay, one of my ideas is indigenous publishing. One of the ways in which academically, or as scholars, as many of you here also mentioned that our histories are oral, many of them are passed from generation to generation. So how do we visit any museum in New York City? Our history is not there, our artifacts are not there, we are non-existent. So in terms of indigenous publishing, we should really, I want to learn about how a child in the Mohawk territory is put to bed with a lullaby. I'm tired of hearing Mary Has a Little Lamb or Baba Black Sheep. I think we got to recognize each other's thing and get that out. The other thing, as I mentioned, is last year we formed what is known as the Global Alliance of Indigenous People, Gender, Justice and Peace. It's really critical that indigenous people and people who love us and who want to ensure that we all coexist, we have to come together on a platform. And the final thing that we tried, and I said to Ms. Elsa, is nowadays indigenous people are so much divided by our nation states and its intelligence agencies, or those people who want to hurt us, like Hana said. If you use the word indigenous, then the newspaper loses 40% of its income, like revenue. So what we have to do is, if there is conflict of any tension of this kind, and it's very, very entrenched, we can get another indigenous people to come and mediate. For example, if two warring factions in Chittagong Hill Tracts struggle because nation states are pulling each other in this, we can get someone from any indigenous nation of the world to come and mediate. We don't want nation states to mediate us because it will cause more unsustainable peace. So I think it's really important that we've got to have innovative approaches because it's really urgent. For us, scholarship has to go with hands in hand with social action on the ground.
Thank you very much. Dina, do we have some other closing remarks?
Well, one thing I like to kind of remind ourselves now when we speak of, because there is no doubt about that there are a number of hotspots, and far too many of them, where sort of the scale of militarization and sort of everyday brutality is absolutely horrifying. But then we also have these other situations, like the Sankas and so many others. It's not like they are living in sort of relative calm at all. I mean, the processes of disposition and so on is going on at an enormous scale. In terms of appropriation for mining purposes, logging purposes, and all of that. But even so, I mean, these can't make the kind of headline necessarily that there are massacres ever so often. But they have been in a state now of invasive historical experiences for 400-500 years. And we need to understand that this didn't start with the British. There was a Mughal period before that, which had its own forms of colonization. And they're also carrying that kind of memory with them. And so even so, they had sustained memories of, in a compact and pregnant number of civilizational shifts, which surely are thousands of years, and we don't recognize it. It's also our heritage. It's not just theirs. We really need to grapple and, collaboratively try to learn from this. And I'm saying this because my projection is a very dire one, that if we get this new era of mass migration across the world, given that our politicians and the private sector is not acting as they should very promptly, state borders is going to massively be collapsing. I doubt that our high-tech technology will be sustained in a manner to preserve all the kinds of culture, kind of remembrances, skills, knowledges we might hope that our modern infrastructure will. I think we will have to again rethink orality as a very profound and central way of intergenerational learning, and I think we should prepare for it instead of ignoring it. Thank you.
I just want to quickly add to what Bina said, and she mentioned the international tribunals. Bangladesh is currently going through a process of the International Crimes Tribunal to address atrocities that the Pakistan government carried out for 9 months. And I mean, while it has its flaws, it is definitely something that can be, Bangladesh government can be praised for what it is doing. Unfortunately, what happened after 1971 inside Bangladesh, the Bangladesh military carried out the same kind of atrocities against its own people in the same way that Pakistan did with Bangladesh, or at the time what was East Pakistan. So I think an international tribunal to address the atrocities that happened through the Bangladesh military would be a great start. And if the international community is involved in this tribunal in some way, that would be a great start. That would be it would, I think, also answer some of the questions that two of you asked about international solidarity. So that's something to think about. In terms of international solidarity, I think the UN Permanent Forum provides a kind of a space where every year some people are able to come, join, and have those and build those solidarities, those networks. I think it's great, but it's also very limited. Unfortunately, it has become even more difficult to talk about these things inside Bangladesh. So I'm hearing about a lot of the indigenous groups who have to go and meet outside Bangladesh to talk about Bangladesh, which is really sad, but this is the situation of things at the moment. So while these are very limited and it is expensive to do these things, it seems that international solidarity has actually helped indigenous people in Bangladesh in some ways, in a very limited, but at the same time there has been some progress because of international solidarity.
That's right. And I would like to add that regarding Bangladesh, it has ratified the Statute of the International Criminal Court. So if there are people who would like to address atrocities in Bangladesh that reach the level of international crimes, people can do that. And this comes to international solidarity wherever it comes. But I think that the acts of international solidarity that should be undertaken actually have to be proposed by the people themselves. For example, because the international solidarity that maybe is appropriate for the Manipur situation that Bina puts forward is slightly different from the one for CHT or other situations that we face in the world. So I thank the panel for bringing